The cruelest betrayals are never the ones that end your life. They are the ones committed by the people you trusted until your very last breath. The bells of the royal capital rang with solemn dignity, their echoes rolling across stone towers and silver rooftops beneath a cold autumn sky. Every citizen had gathered in silence, not for a celebration, but to witness justice as they believed it. Adeline Ashford stood alone in the center of the grand courtyard, her simple grey-blue dress fluttering in the sharp wind, her wrists restrained, her golden brown hair dancing across tearless eyes that had already shed every sorrow they possessed. They called her a traitor. They claimed she had delivered the kingdom's military secrets to its enemies. They insisted she had betrayed the Alpha King she had served with unwavering loyalty for years inside the royal archives. Yet not a single accusation reflected the truth hidden inside her heart. Standing high above the courtyard, dressed in polished black royal armor beneath a crimson cloak that flowed like liquid fire, Alpha King Cassian Blackthorn looked every inch the ruler his people admired. His long black hair stirred with the wind, and the royal sword resting against his side gleamed beneath the pale morning sun. His expression remained unreadable as the High Chancellor presented the sealed decree carrying the royal crest. Adeline searched his face one final time. In another life she would have begged him to believe her. She would have pleaded for one chance to explain the missing documents, the forged letters, the invisible hand that had woven lies around her until even the truth looked guilty. But hope had abandoned her long before this day arrived. Only one face in the crowd smiled beneath a veil of perfect sympathy. Vivian Ashcroft, the kingdom's celebrated Luna, lowered her eyes as though mourning Adeline's fate, while satisfaction quietly shimmered behind her graceful mask. Adeline finally understood. The evidence had never mattered. Someone had written this ending long before she ever stepped into the palace. Cassian accepted the decree with a steady hand. For the briefest heartbeat, an unfamiliar ache tightened inside his chest. His wolf shifted restlessly beneath his calm exterior, whispering that something felt terribly wrong, but duty silenced instinct. The decree was confirmed, and the courtyard fell into complete silence. Adeline closed her eyes, not because she feared what came next, but because she refused to let her final memory be the face of the man she had once loved beyond reason. Instead she remembered the quiet palace library where she first saw him smile at a frightened servant child, the kindness no one else ever noticed, the reason she believed even kings could possess gentle hearts. Darkness should have followed. Instead warmth spread through her fingertips. A familiar scent of old parchment, candle wax, and dried lavender filled the air. She inhaled sharply. Her restraints were gone. The cold stone courtyard had vanished. Startled, she opened her eyes and found herself seated beside a tall window inside the royal archives, afternoon sunlight spilling across unfinished ledgers exactly as it had 3 years before her conviction. A calendar rested on the wooden desk beside her. She stared at the date again and again until her trembling fingers could no longer hold the page still. 3 years. 3 entire years before everything was stolen from her. Her pulse thundered as memories crashed over her like an endless tide. Vivian's gentle smiles. The missing documents. The false witnesses. Cassian's silent judgment. Every unbearable moment remained painfully alive inside her mind. This was no dream. She had been given another chance. Outside the window, palace bells announced the arrival of the Alpha King from his northern campaign, the very day fate had first begun weaving the tragedy she once accepted without question. Adeline slowly rose from her chair, tears glistening without falling. In her first life she had run toward destiny with an open heart. This time she would walk away before destiny ever found her. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a powerful wolf suddenly lifted its head toward the archives, unsettled by a scent it should not have remembered. The greatest victories often begin with a single step that no one else understands. Adeline stood motionless beside the tall archive window until the palace bells faded into the distance. 3 years. She whispered the words silently inside her mind as if repeating them would make this impossible miracle real. 3 years before betrayal wore a friendly smile. 3 years before trust became a weapon. 3 years before she watched an entire kingdom believe a lie. Her fingers brushed the worn oak desk where stacks of untouched royal records waited exactly as they had the first morning she entered the archives. Every scratch in the wood, every faded ribbon binding ancient scrolls, every ray of afternoon sunlight felt painfully familiar. Memory and reality had become one. A young librarian hurried through the doorway carrying an armful of ledgers. Mr. Harlan looked exactly as he had before. His gray beard had grown thin with age. He smiled kindly. "Adeline, everyone is preparing for the king's return. The palace is buzzing like a beehive. You should hurry if you wish to witness the procession." In her first life she would have smiled with excitement. She would have hurried outside simply to catch a distant glimpse of Cassian Blackthorne riding through the palace gates beneath banners of crimson and silver. She remembered every heartbeat of that afternoon. She remembered believing fate had smiled upon her when their eyes briefly met. She remembered how that single moment changed everything. This time she gently lowered her gaze. "I have inventory to finish," she answered softly. Harlan blinked in surprise. "You have never missed one of the king's homecomings." She forced a polite smile. "There will be others." As the old librarian disappeared into the hallway, Adeline closed the heavy register before her. There would not be others if she followed the same path. Every step toward Cassian had carried her closer to the execution courtyard she still remembered with terrifying clarity. She refused to walk that road again. Outside, cheers erupted as the royal procession entered the capital. Even from inside the archives she could hear horses crossing the stone bridge and children laughing as flower petals filled the air. In another life she would already be standing among the crowd searching for one man. Instead she carried several forgotten manuscripts toward the deepest storage chamber beneath the archive tower, choosing solitude over destiny. Yet the moment she crossed the narrow corridor, an icy sensation raced across her skin. Her breathing caught. She knew this feeling. The first time she experienced it, she had dismissed it as nervous excitement. Now she recognized it instantly. Mate bond. Somewhere above the stone ceiling separating the underground archive from the palace courtyard, Cassian had entered the castle grounds. Even separated by thick walls and impossible distance, something ancient stirred between them. Her heartbeat quickened against her will. "No," she whispered firmly inside her mind. "Not again." She pressed one hand against her chest until the strange warmth slowly faded. Fate would not command her life a second time. At that exact moment, high above the archive halls, Cassian dismounted from his black warhorse before the grand palace entrance. Nobles lined both sides of the marble staircase, bowing respectfully as he removed his traveling gloves. The campaign had ended in victory, yet an unexpected restlessness followed him home. His wolf paced silently beneath his calm expression. It ignored the cheers. It ignored the council waiting with official reports. It searched. Cassian frowned almost imperceptibly. Something familiar lingered on the wind. A scent impossible to place. Warm parchment. Lavender. Rain against old stone. His wolf pushed harder, urging him toward the eastern wing of the palace instead of the throne room. "Your Majesty," the captain asked carefully. "The council is assembled." Cassian looked toward the distant archive tower without understanding why. An unfamiliar sadness settled over him for only a heartbeat before discipline buried it beneath years of royal restraint. "The council can wait 5 minutes," he said quietly. Across the palace grounds, hidden behind ancient shelves filled with forgotten histories, Adeline suddenly stopped walking. Without seeing him, she somehow knew the Alpha King had turned toward the archives. And for the first time since awakening in her second life, she realized changing the future might be far more difficult than simply changing her own choices. Some memories refuse to remain buried because the heart remembers long before the mind is ready to listen. Cassian Blackthorne stood in the center of the eastern corridor, his council waiting several yards behind him in respectful silence. He could not explain why his feet had carried him away from the throne room. Every lesson drilled into him since childhood demanded discipline before curiosity, yet an invisible thread tugged him toward the royal archives with quiet persistence. His wolf had become strangely alert, lifting its head as though it had caught the scent of someone long lost. It was impossible. He had returned from months at war only moments ago. No one inside these walls should have mattered enough to distract him from matters of the kingdom. Even so, the sensation refused to disappear. Meanwhile, hidden within endless rows of weathered shelves, Adeline steadied her breathing as she carefully returned a collection of ancient treaties to their proper place. She knew exactly what had happened. In her first life the mate bond had awakened gradually, almost gently. This time it felt different. Stronger. More impatient. As if time itself had become tangled by her impossible return. She closed her eyes and remembered another afternoon years ahead, standing inside this very archive while Cassian unexpectedly thanked her for locating a missing royal decree. That single conversation had blossomed into countless quiet encounters, each one drawing her closer to a future she now feared. She could still remember how hopeful she had been. She could still hear herself believing that honesty and loyalty would always triumph over deception. How painfully innocent she had been. Footsteps echoed through the upper hallway. Adeline immediately recognized the measured pace of palace guards. She slipped farther into the restricted collection, where only archivists with royal permission were allowed to enter. If Cassian reached the archive entrance, she would not be there to greet him. She would not become another familiar face in his daily routine. She would become invisible if she had to. Above her, Cassian entered the grand archive hall for the first time in months. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as librarians bowed respectfully. Mr. Harlan approached with an awkward smile. "Welcome home, Your Majesty. We did not expect the honor of your visit today." Cassian nodded politely while his gray eyes wandered across the towering shelves almost on their own. "I felt the need to stop here." Even to his own ears the explanation sounded strangely incomplete. Harlan gestured proudly toward the reading hall. "Our newest archivists have worked tirelessly during your campaign. The records are in excellent order." Cassian listened, yet another sensation interrupted his thoughts. Lavender. Soft, unmistakable, carried on the faintest breath of air. His wolf stirred with sudden urgency. "Mine." The word flashed through his mind so unexpectedly that he nearly frowned. Mine? He had never experienced such an instinct before. There was no face attached to the feeling, only an overwhelming certainty that someone precious stood very close. Without thinking, he stepped away from Harlan and walked deeper between the towering shelves. Adeline heard his approaching footsteps before she saw the shifting shadows cast across the stone floor. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared he might hear it. Every instinct begged her to run, yet sudden movement would only draw attention. Instead she reached for the nearest ladder and climbed toward the highest shelves, pretending to inspect old census records while keeping her face turned away. Cassian stopped only a few feet below. He looked upward without understanding why. The scent surrounded him now, impossibly familiar despite belonging to someone he could not remember meeting. His wolf became restless, almost desperate. Images flashed behind his eyes without warning. A lonely courtyard beneath gray skies. A young woman smiling sadly. Tears shining but never falling. Then everything vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Cassian blinked, pressing one hand against the ancient bookshelf. "Your Majesty," one of the guards called from the hallway. "The council has assembled." The vision disappeared. The strange ache inside his chest retreated, leaving only confusion behind. He slowly turned away from the shelves. "I am coming," he answered calmly, though nothing inside him felt calm any longer. Only after his footsteps completely faded did Adeline finally allow herself to breathe. She climbed down from the ladder on trembling legs, her fingers cold despite the warm afternoon sunlight. She had changed the meeting that once began their story. She had hidden successfully. Yet the look in Cassian's eyes moments before he left told her something she had never expected. Even when destiny was denied its usual path, his soul was already searching for hers. The most dangerous enemy is the one who notices that fate has begun to change. The morning after the Alpha King's unexpected visit to the royal archives, the palace awakened beneath a blanket of pale golden sunlight, yet Adeline carried the uneasy feeling that invisible eyes had already begun following every step she took. She carefully arranged ancient scrolls across a long oak table, forcing herself to focus on faded maps instead of the memory of Cassian standing only a few feet away the previous afternoon. In her first life, that chance encounter had led to a royal assignment only days later. This morning, no messenger had arrived. No invitation waited on her desk. The future had shifted. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt the strange uncertainty of someone walking through a familiar forest where every path had quietly changed overnight. Across the palace, Vivian Ashcroft stood before a tall mirror while attendants fastened the silver embroidery of her elegant ivory gown. Every noblewoman admired her grace. Every servant praised her kindness. She smiled with effortless warmth whenever anyone entered the room, yet the moment she found herself alone, that gentle smile slowly disappeared. A maid stepped forward and bowed respectfully. "Your Grace, the Alpha King unexpectedly visited the royal archives yesterday before attending the council." Vivian's hand froze upon the jeweled comb resting atop her dressing table. "The archives?" she asked softly. "Are you certain?" The maid nodded. "Several librarians witnessed it." Vivian dismissed the attendants with a pleasant smile that revealed nothing of the thoughts gathering behind her calm eyes. Only after the door quietly closed did she begin pacing across the chamber. In her carefully arranged plans, Cassian had never visited the archives upon returning from war. He had gone directly to the council, exactly as duty demanded. It was a tiny difference, almost meaningless. Yet Vivian had learned long ago that kingdoms rarely fell because of large mistakes. They unraveled through small changes no one considered important until it was too late. Somewhere, something had shifted. Somewhere, someone had taken one unexpected step. Meanwhile, Adeline received an ordinary assignment that should have comforted her. Mr. Harlan requested that she organize diplomatic correspondence stored inside the Eastern Record Vault, a task she had completed dozens of times during her first life. She accepted immediately, grateful for work that kept her far from court gatherings. As she carried several leather-bound volumes through the quiet corridor, her gaze suddenly settled upon a familiar blue ribbon tied around one aging document. Her heart nearly stopped. She remembered that ribbon. In her first life, hidden inside those records had been one of the earliest forged letters later used to accuse her of treason. She stared at the shelf in disbelief. According to memory, that letter should not appear for another 8 months. Slowly she removed the volume and opened it upon the nearest reading table. The pages contained only harmless trade agreements. The forged document was not there. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by another realization. The shelf itself had been prepared. The space where the false letter would eventually appear had already been organized exactly as she remembered. Someone had planned the deception years in advance. A chill traveled down her spine. The trap had not been created overnight. It had been patiently built long before anyone suspected betrayal. Elsewhere, Cassian sat through an endless council session discussing harvest taxes, border repairs, and merchant routes, yet his concentration drifted again and again toward thoughts he could not explain. Several times he caught himself glancing toward the palace windows facing the archive tower. His advisors noticed the distraction but wisely remained silent. At last the meeting ended. As the nobles departed, Cassian remained seated alone beneath the stained glass ceiling. His wolf stirred restlessly once more. Then without warning, another brief vision crossed his thoughts. A pair of trembling hands covered in dust. A soft voice saying, "Please believe me." He immediately stood, disturbed by the unfamiliar memory. It vanished before he could understand whether it belonged to a dream or something far older. At that same moment, hidden inside the Eastern Vault, Adeline carefully closed the ancient record book and whispered a promise only she could hear. "This time I will find the truth before the lie finds me." Unseen by either of them, Vivian watched the archive tower from her balcony, her pleasant smile returning as gracefully as ever, though deep inside she had already decided to begin rewriting her own plans before whoever was changing fate could move first. Changing one choice never changes only one life. It quietly reshapes the lives of everyone connected to it. The following week unfolded with a silence that unsettled Adeline more than open danger ever could. In her first life, these days had been filled with invitations to royal meetings, routine assignments that slowly brought her into the Alpha King's circle, and countless ordinary moments she once believed were gifts from fate. Now those moments never arrived. She remained inside the royal archives, organizing forgotten records while the palace continued around her without asking for her presence. It should have felt like safety, yet every unexpected difference reminded her that history was no longer following the path she remembered. One crisp morning, Mr. Harlan handed her a sealed request from the Ministry of Commerce. "They have misplaced a treaty signed nearly 30 years ago," he explained with an apologetic smile. "The eastern provinces cannot renew their shipping agreement until the original copy is found." Adeline accepted the assignment without hesitation. In her first life, the same treaty had disappeared for nearly 2 weeks before being recovered by another archivist. During that delay, several merchants suffered unnecessary financial losses. She remembered their frustrated voices, the arguments filling the council chambers, and how Cashin personally ordered an investigation. This time she searched the storage vault with memories instead of guesswork. Within less than an hour she located the treaty hidden inside an incorrectly labeled military ledger. When the document reached the ministry that very afternoon, the agreement was signed before sunset. No dispute erupted. No investigation became necessary. Several families whose businesses depended upon river trade unknowingly avoided months of hardship because of one small decision made by a woman determined to rewrite her future. Standing beside the palace window later that evening, Adeline watched merchant wagons leave the capital exactly on schedule. In her previous life, those wagons had remained stranded for weeks. A quiet warmth settled inside her heart. Perhaps changing destiny did not require grand sacrifices. Perhaps saving one ordinary day could eventually save countless lives. Across the palace, Cashin listened as his ministers reported the unusually smooth resolution of the trade negotiations. "Remarkably efficient," Chancellor Edmund remarked with clear satisfaction. An archivist located the missing treaty almost immediately. Cashin looked up from the reports. "Who found it?" The Chancellor consulted his notes. "A junior archivist named Adeline Ashford." The name echoed strangely inside Cashin's thoughts. His wolf immediately became attentive, lifting its head with unmistakable recognition. Again. The same unexplained certainty returned, stronger than before. He had never spoken to this woman. He was almost certain he had never even seen her face. Yet hearing her name stirred emotions that belonged to memories he did not possess. That night's sleep offered him little peace. He dreamed of standing inside an empty courtroom where snow drifted silently through broken windows. Across the room stood a young woman with golden brown hair. She never spoke. She only looked at him with quiet disappointment that somehow hurt more than anger ever could. Before he reached her, she disappeared like morning mist beneath sunlight. Cashin awakened before dawn with his heart racing. He rarely remembered dreams, yet this one refused to fade. Meanwhile, Vivian received her own reports over breakfast. Her trusted attendant described the recovered treaty and praised the archivist responsible. Vivian gently stirred her tea while keeping her expression perfectly pleasant. "Adeline Ashford," she repeated softly, as though tasting an unfamiliar name. "How dependable." The attendant smiled. "Everyone says she is exceptionally careful." Vivian nodded graciously until the servant departed. Then she placed the teacup upon its saucer with measured precision. In her first calculations, Adeline had remained unnoticed until much later. A diligent archivist solving problems ahead of schedule was not dangerous by itself. But patterns concerned Vivian far more than isolated events. Too many small changes were gathering around one insignificant omega. Later that afternoon, as Adeline carefully returned another collection of records to their shelves, she noticed an elderly messenger struggling to carry an overloaded wooden crate across the corridor. Without thinking, she stepped forward and lifted one side to help him. The grateful old man smiled warmly. "Thank you, child. Few people notice old men anymore." Adeline smiled in return, unaware that from the opposite end of the hallway, hidden behind a carved stone pillar, Vivian quietly watched the simple act of kindness with thoughtful eyes. She had expected to find ambition, secrets, or hidden alliances. Instead she found compassion. Somehow that unsettled her far more. The past never returns in exactly the same form. Sometimes it arrives earlier, wearing a different mask. Nearly a month passed, and the palace settled into its familiar rhythm of councils, ceremonies, and endless records, yet Adeline never allowed herself to mistake routine for safety. Every peaceful day felt borrowed. Every quiet sunrise reminded her that the trap she remembered had not disappeared. It had simply not revealed itself yet. She spent each evening comparing archived correspondence with fresh reports arriving from the frontier, searching for inconsistencies that no one else would notice. During her first life she had trusted every official seal placed before her. This time she trusted only facts she could verify with her own eyes. One rainy afternoon, while organizing diplomatic records inside the Eastern Vault, she paused before a newly delivered leather case bearing the crest of the Northern Command. Her heart tightened. In her first life, these reports had arrived almost 6 months later. She slowly broke the wax seal and examined the contents. The reports appeared ordinary at first glance, listing supply inventories and border inspections, yet one date immediately caught her attention. According to her memories, the commander who supposedly signed the document had still been traveling through the western mountains on that exact day. He could not possibly have written it from the northern fortress. Someone had already begun altering official records. The timeline had shifted, but the deception had returned even sooner than before. Adeline carefully copied the suspicious date into a private notebook she had hidden beneath the false bottom of her writing desk. In her previous life she had ignored countless tiny irregularities because she believed experienced officials knew more than she did. Never again. Every inconsistency would become a thread leading toward the truth. As she closed the document, footsteps echoed outside the vault. She quickly returned every record to its proper place before the heavy oak door opened. To her surprise, it was not a palace guard but Cashin himself. The Alpha King had dismissed his escort at the entrance, choosing to walk through the archives alone. For one suspended heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Adeline lowered her eyes respectfully, determined not to repeat the mistakes of her first life. "Your Majesty." Cashin studied the young archivist standing before him. She looked exactly as she had in his dreams. The same gentle eyes. The same quiet composure. The same sadness that seemed far too old for someone so young. His wolf stirred immediately, calmer than it had been in weeks, as though simply standing near her eased an ache he could not explain. "You are Adeline Ashford," he said at last. She inclined her head. "Yes, Your Majesty. The ministers informed me that you recovered the missing trade treaty. I was only doing my duty." Her answer was simple, almost identical to the one she remembered giving him years later in her first life. The memory struck her so suddenly that she nearly forgot where she was. She could still see another version of this conversation unfolding in another lifetime, one that eventually led to trust, admiration, and heartbreak. She forced herself back to the present. Cashin noticed the brief shadow crossing her expression. "Have we met before?" The question escaped before he could stop himself. Adeline's pulse quickened. In her first life he had never asked such a thing. The timeline had changed again. She answered carefully. "No, Your Majesty. I believe you are simply kind enough to remember the names of those who serve the kingdom." Cashin wanted to accept the explanation, yet something inside him refused. It was not kindness that unsettled him. It was recognition. Impossible recognition. Before he could ask another question, hurried footsteps approached from the corridor. A young royal messenger bowed deeply, breathing hard from running. "Your Majesty, Your Grace Vivian requests your presence in the West Garden. She says she has discovered troubling information regarding irregularities in the royal records." Adeline felt every muscle in her body turn cold. Irregularities. The same accusation had begun differently in her first life, but the destination had been the same. Vivian was moving sooner than expected. Cashin glanced once more toward Adeline before following the messenger. He could not explain why leaving the archives suddenly felt like walking away from an unfinished conversation that somehow mattered more than affairs of state. Alone once again, Adeline slowly removed the hidden notebook from beneath her desk and looked at the growing list of impossible dates, altered signatures, and subtle contradictions. She no longer doubted her memories. The trap had returned. Only this time, she intended to be the first person waiting for it to close. Sometimes the truth does not arrive like lightning. Sometimes it awakens one forgotten memory at a time until an entire life can no longer be denied. Cashin followed the messenger through the palace gardens beneath a gray afternoon sky, yet every step carried him farther from the quiet certainty he had unexpectedly felt inside the archives. Vivian greeted him beside the marble fountain with her usual elegance, her gentle smile untouched by worry despite the urgency of her summons. She presented several copied reports gathered from various ministries, pointing out small inconsistencies between shipping manifests and warehouse inventories. "Nothing alarming yet," she said softly. "But I thought Your Majesty should know that someone within the record offices may be making careless mistakes." Cashin studied the documents in silence. They contained irregular dates and mismatched references, but none of them seemed serious enough to justify suspicion. Even so, one detail unsettled him. Every report had passed through offices connected to the royal archives. His thoughts immediately returned to Adeline. His wolf rejected the implication before his mind had even finished considering it. Not her. The certainty came so suddenly that Cashin almost looked around, expecting another voice to have spoken aloud. Vivian noticed the hesitation hidden behind his calm expression. "I only wish to protect the kingdom," she continued gently. Perhaps a quiet review of the archives would prevent larger problems later. Cashin nodded politely, yet something inside him resisted the suggestion with growing strength. He could not explain why defending an archivist he barely knew felt more natural than doubting her. After leaving the garden, he dismissed every attendant and wandered alone through the western training grounds where rows of practice weapons rested beneath open shelters. His hand settled almost unconsciously upon the hilt of the ceremonial sword reserved for royal oaths. The instant his fingers wrapped around the familiar leather grip, the world around him seemed to disappear. A cold courtyard emerged before his eyes. Snow drifted silently across empty stone. A young woman stood several steps away, her golden brown hair stirred by winter wind. She was not afraid. She was only heartbroken. Her lips moved, though no sound reached him. Then tears shimmered in her eyes as she whispered words he somehow understood despite the silence. "I never betrayed you." Cashin staggered backward, releasing the sword as the vision vanished. His breathing became uneven. His heart pounded with a grief so deep it felt impossible for memories that did not belong to this life. He pressed both hands against his temples, struggling to understand what he had seen. It had not felt like imagination. It had felt like remembrance. At that same hour, Adeline remained deep within the Eastern Vault comparing fresh military correspondence against decades of archived reports. The hidden notebook beside her had grown thicker with every passing day. Dates. Signatures. Supply orders. Every inconsistency formed another piece of a puzzle she had once failed to recognize. Then her eyes settled upon a familiar crest stamped in faded blue wax. Her breath caught. During her first life, this particular courier company had unknowingly transported several forged documents between ministries before disappearing from official records entirely. She immediately copied the company name into her notebook and circled it twice. This was the first solid thread connecting the old conspiracy to the new timeline. As she closed the ledger, someone quietly knocked against the half-open archive door. It was the elderly messenger she had helped days earlier. He smiled warmly before placing a small wrapped bundle upon her desk. "A traveler asked me to deliver this only if I found Miss Adeline Ashford," he explained. He said no name should accompany it. Curious, Adeline carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a small bronze seal engraved with the crest of the Royal Archives as it had existed nearly 20 years earlier, long before she was born. Beneath it lay a single folded note written in careful script. Do not trust records that arrive already complete. Seek the first copy, not the final one. Her pulse quickened. Someone else knew the truth was hidden inside the archives. Someone else had noticed the false trail years before she ever returned. She looked toward the palace window where distant storm clouds gathered above the towers. For the first time since awakening in her second life, she realized she was no longer fighting alone. And somewhere else within the palace, Cassian stood motionless beneath the fading light, haunted by a woman's sorrowful eyes that his heart recognized even though his memory still refused to speak her name. The moment hidden truths begin to surface is often the moment those who built the lies become truly afraid. Rain drummed softly against the stained glass windows as another week passed beneath gathering autumn clouds. Adeline guarded the anonymous bronze seal and mysterious note as carefully as any royal treasure, revealing their existence to no one. Whoever had sent them clearly understood that the kingdom's greatest danger was not a missing document but the quiet replacement of truth itself. Every evening after the archives closed, she remained behind beneath the warm glow of candlelight, comparing original records with revised copies stored in different wings of the palace. Slowly a pattern emerged. The earliest versions always carried small details that later disappeared. Dates changed. Marginal notes vanished. Witness signatures became fewer. Someone had spent years carefully polishing history until every inconvenient fact simply ceased to exist. In her first life she had accepted the final copies without question. This time she searched only for beginnings. One evening she unlocked an abandoned cabinet that had not appeared in official inventory for decades. Hidden beneath damaged tax ledgers rested a narrow wooden box coated with dust. Inside she found several faded courier receipts stamped with the same forgotten transport company whose crest now filled several pages of her private notebook. Every receipt listed destinations connected to ministries later involved in the accusations against her. More importantly, each shipment contained 2 entries. One labeled original archive copy. Another labeled revised council copy. Her heart pounded. The deception had never depended upon forging a single document. Someone had created an entire parallel system where original records quietly disappeared while altered versions became official history. Across the palace, Cassian found little peace. The mysterious visions grew stronger with every passing day. During council sessions he occasionally lost himself for only a heartbeat, seeing fragments of another life layered upon the present. A quiet library corridor. Snow falling through an open courtyard. A young woman smiling despite tears she refused to shed. None of the memories lasted long enough to explain themselves, yet each one left behind the same overwhelming emotion. Regret. His wolf had stopped resisting the truth altogether. Whenever Adeline's name appeared in conversation or her scent drifted faintly through palace halls, an unfamiliar calm settled over him, followed almost immediately by deep sorrow he could not explain. Late one afternoon he returned alone to the royal archives under the simple excuse of reviewing historical treaties. Harlan gladly welcomed the unexpected visit and pointed toward the Eastern collection where several archivists continued their work. Cassian entered quietly, intending only to satisfy the strange instinct that had refused to leave him for weeks. As he rounded a tall shelf, he found Adeline kneeling beside several open ledgers, carefully comparing faded handwriting beneath a magnifying lens. She did not notice him immediately. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she copied notes into a small notebook before gently returning each record exactly where she had found it. Cassian watched silently, surprised by the care she devoted to work few people would ever notice. Without lifting her eyes she spoke softly. "Your Majesty, these records deserve patience. They remember things people forget." The words struck him with impossible force. Suddenly another memory flashed across his mind. The same voice. The same sentence. But spoken years later beneath entirely different circumstances. He instinctively stepped closer. "Have you said that to me before?" Adeline looked up, startled by the question. For a brief instant their eyes met without rank, titles, or distance standing between them. She saw confusion in his expression, but also genuine kindness that had not existed on the day he condemned her in another lifetime. Pain tightened inside her chest. "No, Your Majesty," she answered gently. "Perhaps it only feels familiar because some truths never change." Before Cassian could reply, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. A royal guard bowed deeply, carrying a sealed order bearing the council's crimson seal. "Your Majesty, urgent news. Lady Vivian has requested an immediate emergency hearing. She claims evidence has been discovered suggesting that confidential military records have once again been altered." Silence settled over the archive. Adeline slowly lowered her gaze toward the hidden notebook resting beside her hand. The accusation she had spent weeks trying to outrun had finally arrived, only far earlier than it had in her first life. Yet unlike before, she no longer stood empty-handed. Hidden inside her notebook, beneath anonymous warnings and forgotten receipts, rested the first real pieces of evidence that could expose a conspiracy powerful enough to rewrite an entire kingdom's history. When a lie survives for years, it begins to fear the smallest piece of truth. The royal council chamber filled long before the emergency hearing began. Ministers whispered behind polished oak benches while commanders, judges, and noble families exchanged uncertain glances. Rumors had already spread through the palace that confidential military records had been compromised. Adeline stood quietly near the entrance, carrying a simple leather satchel that appeared no different from the countless archive cases transported through the palace each day. Hidden inside rested her notebook, the forgotten courier receipts, and the anonymous bronze seal that had already changed everything she believed about the kingdom's history. Cassian entered wearing his black royal armor beneath the familiar crimson cloak that flowed behind him. The room immediately fell silent. Yet before taking his seat upon the raised dais, his eyes searched the chamber almost instinctively until they found Adeline. The strange weight inside his chest eased for only a moment. He did not understand why seeing one quiet archivist had become the only thing capable of calming the storm growing inside his mind. Vivian stepped gracefully into the center of the chamber, every movement poised and dignified. "Your Majesty," she began, "recent evidence suggests that official military records have once again been altered. If our enemies learn such weaknesses exist within the archives, the kingdom itself may suffer." Murmurs spread across the council. Cassian listened carefully without interrupting. "Do you know who is responsible?" he asked. Vivian lowered her eyes with practiced reluctance. "Not yet. But the alterations appear to originate from archive collections normally accessed only by senior staff and trusted archivists." The accusation floated through the chamber without naming anyone directly, yet Adeline recognized the pattern immediately. In her first life, this was exactly how suspicion had begun. Quietly. Respectably. One carefully placed doubt at a time. Cassian looked toward the ministers. "Before anyone is judged, every claim will be examined with evidence, not assumption." The word surprised even him. In another life he might have accepted the first explanation placed before him. Now an unfamiliar certainty refused to let him do so. Adeline stepped forward with steady composure. "Your Majesty, may I address the council?" The chamber grew still. Archivists rarely spoke during royal hearings. Cassian nodded. "You may." Adeline placed the worn courier receipts upon the council table one by one. She explained how original archive copies and revised council copies had traveled through separate channels for years. She presented the forgotten transport records, the mismatched dates, and the sequence of revisions hidden across multiple ministries. Every document supported the next with quiet precision. No dramatic accusation escaped her lips. She simply allowed the records to speak for themselves. Several ministers leaned closer, comparing signatures with growing concern. The Chancellor's expression slowly changed from skepticism to astonishment. "These revisions began long before our current administration," he whispered. "Someone built this system over many years." Vivian maintained her graceful composure, but for the first time uncertainty flickered across her face. She had expected panic, confusion, and hurried accusations. Instead, the Omega she once believed insignificant had arrived carrying patience, preparation, and undeniable facts. Cashin picked up one faded receipt bearing the forgotten courier crest. The instant his fingers touched the old parchment, another memory crashed through him with breathtaking clarity. He saw Adeline standing before him in another lifetime, desperately holding similar records while pleading for an opportunity to explain. He remembered himself turning away, believing forged evidence over sincere truth. The vision disappeared almost instantly, but its sorrow remained. His heart tightened with a grief that felt both ancient and immediate. Looking toward Adeline, he realized the quiet sadness he had sensed since returning from war had never belonged to the present alone. It belonged to a mistake his soul somehow remembered even if his mind still struggled to understand it. The council chamber remained wrapped in stunned silence as Cashin slowly rose from his throne. No judgment will be issued today, he declared firmly. Every original archive record connected to these findings will be secured and examined before another word of accusation is spoken. Relief did not flood Adeline's heart as she expected. Instead she felt something quieter and far more fragile. Hope. Not because the battle had been won, but because for the first time across 2 lifetimes, the truth had been given permission to speak before the lie could decide the ending.